Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Schanzer. I'm Vice President for Research here at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I want to welcome you here to our event on the aftermath of Turkey's elections. This should be a very exciting discussion today. I'm very pleased to have with us John Hannah, FDD Senior Counselor, who will be moderating this discussion, but also we're particularly pleased to have our two panelists, Aykan Erdemir, who has now joined FDD as a non-resident fellow based in Turkey, but here with us for this week. Aykan just recently finished a term as a member of parliament in Turkey. And of course, to his right is Ambassador Eric Edelman, who's been an advisor to FDD's Turkish program. He, of course, served in Ankara as America's ambassador. Today's panel comes on the heels of a somewhat of a surprising election that took place last Sunday in Turkey. We want to try to dissect what it all means. The only thing that I would like to tell you now is if you have your cell phones on, please set them to stun. And we will have a formal discussion followed by your questions, and we'll be sure to try to get as many of those in as possible. So for now, I turn it over to John, and I thank you very much for being here.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. As Jonathan said, my name is John Hannah, and I'm Senior Counselor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and I've got the real pleasure of moderating today's panel. For those of you here in the audience and or watching on C-SPAN who are not familiar with FDD, we are a Washington-based think tank focused on conducting in-depth research on the array of threats and challenges facing the United States and our allies in the Middle East and globally, and on developing the policies and programs necessary to defend against those threats and secure America's vital national interests. If you'd like to learn more about FDD's research and our scholars, I'd invite people to visit us on the web at www.defenddemocracy.org and to follow us on Twitter at #FollowFDD. Jonathan said today we're talking Turkey, specifically the June 7th parliamentary elections and their implications for Turkey and the United States. In a word, I think these elections were big. After 13 years of an ever-expanding domination of Turkey's political life by the AKP party and its founder, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish people appear to have finally said something like enough is enough. If this election was about anything, it was a referendum of sorts on Erdogan's burning desire to convert Turkey's parliamentary system into a highly centralized executive presidency, with Erdogan himself the repository of most, if not all, state power, an elected sultan, an Anatolian version of Putin, if you will. And the Turkish people appear to have responded to Erdogan's almost unlimited ambition with a resounding no, not only denying Erdogan and the AKP for the first time a ruling majority in the parliament, but giving almost 60% of their votes to parties openly dedicated to stopping Erdogan's drive for sole power dead in its tracks, including the HDP, a Kurdish-dominated secular progressive party that has empowered Turkey's large and historically problematic Kurdish minority to play an unprecedented role in the future of the country's legitimate democratic politics. Although there are lots of questions and that remain to be answered, and no doubt lots of difficulties that lie ahead for Turkey, June the 7th was, to my mind, an enormously inspiring performance, a much-needed triumph for the spirit of liberal democracy in a Middle East landscape currently inundated by way too much bad news. For those of us who have watched over the past decade with great dismay the slow drip, drip, drip of Turkey's democracy being drained away by Erdogan's creeping Islamism and authoritarianism, we frankly weren't sure anymore that the Turkish people still had this kind of election in them. Erdogan appeared to have been so successful over the years in grinding Turkish society down demagoguing some constituencies, demonizing others, instilling such a high degree of fear and intimidation in the system that it was unclear that any group or institution still had the courage or the wherewithal to stand up to him. Well, I think to a lot of people's pleasant surprise, we got our answer a week ago last Sunday. Turkish people did indeed stand up to Erdogan and mustered no small amount of courage to send a loud and fairly unambiguous message that the erosion of Turkish democracy must stop here. That, I think, is worth noting and worth celebrating. But now comes the hard part. How does the result on election day now get translated into meaningful change and governance? What comes next for Turkey? That, of course, is the subject of our panel today. And as Jonathan noted, a great panel it is. I don't say so myself. Jonathan said, Aykan Erdemir, I want to welcome him as well, making his debut as a non-resident fellow in FDD's new and ever-expanding Turkey program, which Jonathan Schanzer oversees, with a big assist from an FDD researcher, Merve Tahiroglu, who incidentally, people should know, is one of the best and brightest young scholars working on Turkey today in Washington. We're also joined by my great friend and colleague, Ambassador Eric Edelman, who doesn't require an introduction, but I want to say a few things anyway, because I really do love singing Eric's praises. Eric had an incredibly distinguished career in the U.S. Foreign Service. He concluded his time in government as the Undersecretary of Defense at the Pentagon right after he served for 2 years as America's ambassador to Turkey. It must be said, for the historical record, I think, that Eric had Erdogan's number long before almost anyone else in Washington had a clue of what was really happening in Turkey. And he still got the battle scars to prove it from his time in Ankara. No one was more perceptive or more right about Erdogan and his underlying agenda and the potential challenges they were eventually going to pose for both Turkey and the United States. I still remember Eric walking into the Oval Office, I can't remember if it was late 2003, early 2004, to participate in a pre-brief with President Bush in advance of Erdogan's first visit to Washington as Turkey's prime minister. It was still a time when most Turkey watchers in the government were, to be frank, rather starry-eyed about Erdogan, the great reformer, the moderate Islamist, the man who was going to transform Turkey into a modern, vibrant, pro-Western Muslim democracy that would serve as the ideal model for the rest of the Middle East to follow. Well, that day Eric walked into the Oval Office, took me aside, shook my hand, and said in a low voice, "John, we've got a serious problem here, but no one in Washington seems to realize it." How right he was. Unfortunately, it would take the greater part of another decade before the rest of Washington began catching up to Eric, not to mention a good part of the people of Turkey. Eric today wears many hats. He's a distinguished scholar at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment, a professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He served as a member of the influential congressionally mandated Defense Policy Panel. But as Jonathan noted, most important for our purposes, he's now a senior advisor to FDD's Turkey program, and it's great to have him as part of that team and to welcome him here today. So the way that the discussion will work is that I'm going to pose my own questions to Aykan and Eric for about the first 35 or 40 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to you in the audience for your questions and comments. We'll cover as much ground as we can and conclude as close to 1:15 as possible. With that, let's get started. Let me get this going by simply asking both of you now, after I've given kind of the optimistic or partially optimistic assessment of what might have happened on June the 7th, to just spend a few minutes for each of you telling us what you think the main headlines were from what happened in the elections. What exactly were the main takeaways for you? Aykan, why don't we start with you?
Okay, in general in Turkey, when we have the elections, we try to anthropomorphize the electorate. we think of the whole Turkish electorate as a single individual, and then we always come up with the conclusion the Turkish electorate said no to the executive presidential system, the Turkish electorate said no to authoritarianism and majoritarianism, and the development of a party state. The electorate said yes to Kurdish representation in the parliament, and so on and so forth. If we take it at that level, it's quite an optimistic message. But if we take a look at the exit polls, I think we might see a more shades of gray. And I think this is going to be my role today here, just to warn you that it's not all a rosy picture. Where to begin? Maybe we can say that, first of all, we had two consolidated parties in the election. CHP and AKP shared one thing in common. 90% of their grassroots were decided, their followers were decided to vote for these parties 2 weeks in advance of the elections. So here we see two solid support bases for CHP and AKP. But then we had MHP, Turkey's Nationalist Party, and HDP, Turkey's Kurdish Party. Two parties which received quite a lot of strategic votes, swing votes, in the last week. So these are the parties where almost 1 out of 5 voters came within the last week. And to be frank, the assumption is the votes that came to MHP happened to be Erdogan skeptics, and the votes that came to HDP happened to be, again, authoritarian skeptics who would like to see some Kurdish representation in the parliament. Are difficult to argue. These two arguments are difficult to prove. What we see is a lot of the Kurdish conservatives swinging to HDP within the last week. And in the exit polls, we see that these people still see Erdogan as the most successful leader of the campaign. 13% of the HDP voters think Erdogan was the most successful leader of the campaign, although he wasn't a party to the elections. So, as some scholars warn us, we should not overemphasize the overall progressive nature of the HDP vote. This is a big coalition, maybe 10 to 20% of progressive secular Kurdish leadership at the top, and then a vast base, a follower base, which shares a lot in common with AKP's values and politics. And we've seen that that base actually got stronger this time because more conservative Kurdish vote came to HDP. Similarly, and I'll end here, what we see with the MHP vote is they received quite a lot of swing votes from AKP within the last week. But these are, again, people who share quite a lot with the AKP values and policies, and probably they thought Erdogan was overstepping his mandate and his position. But in the exit polls, a week after the elections, when they were asked, now that you know the election results, would you have voted otherwise? We see almost 5% of that MHP voters saying, if I knew the results would have been this way, I would have voted for AKP. So they're now regretting their MHP vote, and they might swing back to AKP. And we also see the same with HDP voters. So maybe we should not, my take-home message would be, we should not read too much of a progressive, liberal, democratic interpretation into these elections. But we should not underemphasize, we should not kind of belittle the importance of the elections, because ultimately Turkish elections of June 7th proved us that there could be a return from competitive authoritarianism, where an incumbent with huge advantages can nevertheless suffer a relative defeat at the ballot box. And I think this is an important message for the region nevertheless.
Eric.
Thank you, John, and thank you for that really generous introduction. I found it a little intimidating and inhibiting because now no matter what I say, it's going to be downhill from there. So, first, I agree both, John, with you and what Icahn has just said, which is to say there are some positive elements here in the election results, but I share Icahn's concern that the overall picture is more cloudy and maybe has some dark clouds within the silver lining, if you will. So first, the election result clearly puts in place at least a speed bump in the way of the former Prime Minister, now President's efforts to create an executive presidency. And I think that's a positive thing for Turkish democracy. Secondly, the fact of the HDP's successful campaign and its ability to get over the 10% threshold, which after all was designed to keep them out of parliament, is both a mark of the maturation of Turkish democracy, but also potentially a positive sign for the country's ability to finally resolve the issues of the Kurdish minority. But having said all that, the election result, I think, also reveals that Turkey remains a very, very deeply divided society. Icahn talked a little bit about that, but if you look at the map of the geographical distribution of votes, there is a sliver along the Aegean coast where CHP has most of its vote. There are some places in the center of the country and along the Mediterranean coast where MHP is strong, HDP obviously strong in the southeast, and then in all the rest of the heartland of the country, and the Black Sea coast is all AKP country. And it looks a little bit like some of the maps that are drawn of the United States, the red-blue maps of Republican domination of rural and ex-urban areas in the United States, and Democratic domination of urban areas. You see these big swaths of red surrounded by little enclaves of blue. Turkey is a very deeply polarized society, and the bad news there is that the AKP is the only party that is competitive across the nation. The others are not competitive everywhere in the country. So AKP in this deeply divided society remains the only national party. Secondly, we now face a very uncertain future for Turkey with a hung parliament and the prospects for formation of a government not immediately clear, at least to me. The president was uncharacteristically quiet for the first 3 or 4 days after the election, but he is now clearly back in action. And one thing that I think he is trying to demonstrate by his actions is that he is not going to see this vote as in any way inhibiting him in his effort to create this executive presidency. He has already taken a number of steps that clearly are not within the ambit of the Constitution, announcing that he is going to be calling party leaders together to meet with them individually before he turns it over to Prime Minister Davutoglu to try and form a government. He's also making it clear that he thinks that there's a very reasonable prospect that there won't be a government and that the country will have to go back to elections. That is despite the fact that the Prime Minister has indicated that perhaps a grand coalition with the CHP, something that Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu has also suggested might be in the country's best interest, might be possible. My suspicion is that the President does not want to see a government formed within the 45-day time frame set by the Constitution, and would like to see the country go back to elections, in part because he reads the exit polls, I think, the same way Icahn does, and he thinks that there's a chance that if Turkey applies the EU standard, which is we're going to make you keep voting until I get the right answer, that there is a chance that that in fact that he will do better in a second election, that he will get at least a governing majority, if not the supermajority that he thinks he needs to put in place amendments to the Constitution to enshrine his executive presidency. So I foresee a period of some political instability, perhaps greater market volatility and economic issues for Turkey. and a very uncertain outcome.
Okay, Icon, can you just run us through the technical process of what's the way forward now in terms of how the effort to form a government will be made? What are the necessary steps technically and constitutionally that have to be followed?
Yes. The newly elected Turkish deputies are still to be sworn in. Once the ceremony takes place at the Turkish Parliament within the next week, there will be the elections for the Speaker of the Parliament. And those elections will provide us some hint as to what might happen with the coalition government, because right now no party has the majority to elect the Speaker of the Parliament. And if the opposition parties decide to do so, if they decide to unite their votes, they can actually, for the first time in 13 years, elect a Speaker of the Parliament who is not from the AKP. Right after that starts the clock, the 45 days for the coalition talks. And I also agree that with Ambassador Edelman that President Erdogan probably would like to run the clock. And he can do this in a couple of ways. He has shown that he will try to be part of the coalition talks and deals. He also has quite a number of loyalists and followers within the new group of deputies who can make the coalition building efforts difficult. And more importantly, reading the exit polls, the President Erdogan knows that there is now a group of voters, both among the HDP voters and MHP voters, who said that they would have voted for AKP had they known the election results. Now, this swing back to AKP will probably not push HDP below the 10% threshold, though it is still likely, but I think MHP will suffer even more. And if within the next 45 days there isn't a viable coalition, we can have re-elections, snap elections, which Erdogan, I think, is hoping that will bring once again a single-party AKP rule. When the voters were asked, "What's your preferred coalition?" AKP-MHP coalition seems to be the most favorite coalition in Turkey, followed by a coalition of the three opposition parties. In my opinion, the first one is quite likely because two parties share quite a lot in common, AKP and MHP. This, of course, would imply a return to probably hardline nationalist policies vis-à-vis the Kurdish question and the region. And what is also desired, the three opposition parties forming a coalition, feels good for the majority of Turks, but seems to be quite difficult to manage because of the difficulty of commensurating HDP's and MHP's Turkish, Kurdish, respectively Kurdish and Turkish nationalist policies. So we will see whether Turkish politicians still have in them consensus building skills to overcome the hurdle. You should keep in mind that right after the elections, one of the most searched terms on Google was coalition, because Turkey now has a generation of people who have never lived with a coalition, who have never seen coalition talks, and most of the deputies in the Turkish parliament have never ever served in a parliament where coalition Turks and negotiation and consensus building were part of the political game. So this will indeed be a challenge.
Okay, but just to clarify, so the parliament gets seated, and then it is Erdogan's role as president to actually tap someone to form the government?
The constitution does give the president the authority, but the Turkish tradition is that the leader of the majority party should receive this opportunity. Now, when we talk about tradition, of course, we should also realize Erdogan is the great defier of tradition. So we never know what cards he has up his sleeve.
But we presume he will tap Davutoglu, and then does Davutoglu, can he run out that 45 days, or does he have a specific time limit within that 45 days that he can try and form a parliament, and then the president has to offer it to another party?
He can run the clock, but if he had, we don't, but if he had a president who had an interest in forming a coalition government, he could have nudged gently for Davutoglu to give up the responsibility, but that probably is not likely.
Okay, so in theory, Davutoglu could just simply spend in CHP, would never get a chance to be the one to try and form a coalition. Eric, let me put on your prognosticator's hat and tell me what do you think the most likely scenario is here? Do you think we're going to run out the clock and go to a new election, or is there a chance for a coalition or a minority government even? And if so, what kind of government?
It's a little hard for me to imagine an actual coalition emerging from this. So, as Icahn said, in some sense, and I think most observers would say the most likely coalition one could envisage would be a MHP AKP coalition, because there is some commonality there in the worldviews of the parties and some of what the voters believe, their respective voters believe. However, I would note that Mr. Baceli, the head of the MHP, has been quoted as saying, "Yes, fine, we'll be happy to have a coalition, but the conditions for that will be that the ministers accused of corruption in the corruption scandal that broke in December 2013 have to be brought before the bar of justice. And oh, by the way, that includes your son, Bilal. Give us Bilal, and then we can have a government." And also that the president would have to abide by the understood constitutional norms of the Turkish Republic, which is to stop chairing cabinet meetings, stop inserting himself into the process of forming a coalition government. It's extremely difficult for me to imagine the president and the AKP agreeing to any of those conditions. So the idea that you're actually going to get an AKP MHP government, I think is hard to imagine. I think both Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu and the Prime Minister have suggested, at least in their public comments, that they're open to a kind of grand coalition, that would represent 60 to 65% of the voters, which would in some sense overcome this deep sense of division that I mentioned in my opening remarks. But I find it hard to believe that coalition will be formed either, because the two parties are just so far apart, and were the CHP to agree to a coalition that didn't impose some of these same conditions that MHP has talked about, that is to say holding the government accountable for corruption and the president accountable for behaving within the Constitution, I think actually it would damage them in the future. I mean, it might give them a chance to hold ministerial portfolios, or few of them, for a while, but I don't think it would actually enhance the party's prospects electorally in the future. On the contrary, I think it would diminish them. So it's a little bit, and Mr. Demirtas has said that coalition is out of the question for the HDP, and I can't imagine him actually entering into a coalition. Whether he would be willing, although he said he would not do this, whether he'd be willing to silently support a AKP minority government, I think that's a more open question, and I wouldn't exclude that. I wouldn't rule that out. But the reality is, even if we get a coalition government, the history of coalition governments in Turkey is of weak governments that don't last very long. And so I think, one way or another, we're going to be back Turkish political parties going to be back in an election campaign going to the voters, sooner, I think, rather than later.
Okay, and on the AKP and Erdogan's position in particular, we've heard a lot over the years of rumors of disagreements and tensions within the party. Those appear to have been possibly exacerbated by the results of the elections. I think there's a new book out by an advisor to former President Gül that highlights a lot of the disagreements between the former president and President Erdogan, particularly over things like the protests in Gezi Park, the corruption scandals that Eric mentioned at the end of 2013 and how those should have been handled. Can anything come of that over the next several weeks or months? Is Erdogan going to suffer any price within the AKP? Is there any chance that former President Gül will try and make a comeback? Or is Erdogan still very much the man in control, dominating this party, and he will get his way? Aykan?
I would argue the way in which this book was launched is very indicative of Abdullah Gül's style in politics. The book was written by his chief advisor of the last 12 years, Ahmet Sever, and the book was ready actually a month and a half ago. But Abdullah Gül told him, wait until after the elections so that we don't hurt. He didn't say that, but so that the implication is so that we don't hurt the AKP's campaign. So Gül has so far been the very timid, careful politician who doesn't like taking risks too much, and he's doing it again in a very gentle manner. He will probably not be too proactive in trying to have a takeover attempt within the AKP. On the contrary, we might actually see Ahmet Davutoğlu declaring his independence by trying to take greater control of the party. He has already indicated a few times that the president should stay in his role, and the coalition talks should be among the leaders and not with the president. So we might see him slowly trying to assert his leadership, but of course he knows his limits and the extent to which Erdogan has loyalists in the deputy group.
Eric, let me, you can comment on this if you want to, but I also did want to just ask you about the variable of the Turkish economy and how it might play into these scenarios. I mean, even before these elections, there was serious signs of trouble, particularly the drop in the lira being a good indicator, which was exacerbated by the results in the elections. Just how nervous do you think the markets are, foreign investors are, and does this kind of potential growing uncertainty about Turkish politics help or hurt Erdogan and the AKP in your view going forward?
Well, I do want to come back to the question of the recent book that details these disagreements between former President Abdullah Gül and the incumbent president, and also to Aykan's comments, which I agree with. But look, the economy already, we haven't mentioned it yet, but it was the other big factor, I think, in the election besides the resistance to Erdogan's pretensions to a stronger presidency. The economy has been slowing down for some time. Turkish voters, I think this is pretty well established by the social science, are not that different from voters in the United States in the sense that they are retrospective voters. They frequently are voting on the economic record of the previous government. And that is one thing that has been a major source of strength for AKP since 2002. But the slowing economy it clearly hurt. I think you were right to point to the decline in the lira. I think the lira is down about 30% now against the dollar since the beginning of the year. I think that the current account deficit, which has been extraordinarily high for a number of years, the fact that a lot of the foreign direct investment that's gone into Turkey has been portfolio investment and is hot money that is moving in and out of the country. I think a prolonged period of political instability, particularly if it ends up being accompanied by violence in the southeast, for instance, which you already see some signs of that over the last week since the election, could combine to exacerbate some structural problems in the Turkish economy and lead to a real crisis. Turkey's post-World War II economic history is a history of boom-bust, what one of my predecessors, Morta Abramowitz, used to call a sine wave economy. And I think you could see that reemerge now and become a factor in future elections. It's actually one reason why Erdogan may want to have an election sooner rather than later, before the economic bill for all of this comes due. Let me just say one thing about former President Gül. I agree with Aykan that although he has had no shortage of both public and more private criticisms of President Erdogan and the course that he has set for the AKP over the last decade, he has never really shown the stomach for a political fight that many people had hoped he would have, because I think, let's face it, I mean, the logical conclusion from what I said at the outset of my remarks, which is that AKP is the only effective national party, that the other parties cannot really compete across the nation, and that really one of the things that has undermined Turkish democracy over the last decade and a half has been the weakness of the opposition and the inability of Turkish voters to conceive of them as an alternative parties of governance, actually see them running the country, has been one of the great advantages that AKP has had. And the only way that's going to change is if at some point AKP fractures and fragments, and there's a kind of new constellation that emerges of Turkish political parties that is capable of creating a governing majority that can move the country forward.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask quickly about a very important topic, which is even more uncertain as we come out of the election, which is the Kurdish issue and how these elections are going to affect the peace process. At one point in time, it seemed that perhaps a major motive for the president to be engaged in this peace process was he thought the Kurds, in fact, would be the constituency that pushed him over the top in terms of getting the majority he needed to create the executive presidency. And now we appear to have the opposite result, and that, in fact, these elections and the peace process and the Kurdish issue has actually strengthened an alternative Kurdish party, weakened the AKP, and empowered another party, the MHP, that seems quite opposed to the entire process. So can we say anything about how the elections are likely to affect this peace process that seems quite fragile, bogged down? Are they likely to help, hurt, or is it all depend on what eventually emerges in terms of any kind of governing coalition?
I think Erdogan's magic has always been his ability to attract both Turkish nationalist and Kurdish nationalist votes. And with this election, he puzzled us once again, but this time by losing both the Turkish nationalist and the Kurdish nationalist vote. In the last 2 weeks of the campaign, he did appeal to Turkish nationalism at the expense of the Kurdish votes. But ultimately, he emerged losing both ends of his support base. So today, I think what happens is, from my point of view, the Kurdish vote seems to be gone. And I think it's a one-way swing vote. It will be very difficult for Erdogan to re-attract the Kurdish vote, Kurdish conservative vote, back to AKP. There is a new sense of ethnic solidarity. There are different dynamics within the region. There is, I think, a new Kurdish consciousness rising in the region. As opposed to, if we compare this to the Turkish nationalist vote, I think that vote can come back to AKP. Which means, again, if we also think that AKP-MHP coalition is more likely, Turkey might be going for a disaster scenario vis-a-vis the Kurdish question. That is, Turkey might go back to the denialist policies of the 1990s, and AKP-MHP coalition could be quite a hardliner coalition. And I've heard comments on both sides highlighting the military/security option. One thing which both AKP and MHP deputies and leaders are missing is Turkey is no longer the Turkey of 1990s. Kurds are no longer the Kurds of 1990s, and Turkish security presence in Turkish Kurdish majority regions are nowhere near the 1990s. Turkish state and military and the police no longer have the same options on the table, no longer have the same capability, and I also used to serve as a volunteer/shadow MP for Batman in the Kurdish majority region. And to be frank, people who know the region, who know the everyday life in the region, can point out to you the vast difference between what we have today as opposed to 1990s. Today, the PKK seems to have full control of the region, and any attempt by an AKP-MHP coalition to impose, let's say, a security-centered approach, more of a Turkish Islamic synthesis approach on the region, will backfire and will probably fuel a lot of unrest, like we have seen with the Kobani uprisings.
Eric, can I just ask you again, if you want to comment on the overall impact on the peace process, please do. But is it significant at all that the Kurds have now gone to the ballot box and elected this party that may be made up of PKK sympathizers, but is not necessarily fully convergent with the PKK? Does this introduce anything interesting, do you think, into Kurdish politics in Turkey, or is, as I think Aykan just suggested, probably too strong to say the HDP is somehow a puppet of the PKK, but on core questions of what's going to happen in the southeast and in Kurdish politics, it is still very much the PKK that has the major voice and is going to call the shots on whether Turkey goes towards peace or towards another outbreak of conflict.
Well, as I said, John, I do think it's very interesting and potentially a positive development that the HDP has made it into Parliament. However, I'm a little bit concerned that because of the uncertainty of where we're headed, that it could end up being just all for naught, if you will, that it won't make that much difference. But first, if we get an MHP, AKP coalition, I think clearly the price for that's going to be an end to the peace process. MHP has said that in so many words. So it's great, that you've got these 80 Kurdish parliamentarians who've now arrived in the parliament. And by the way, it's not just Kurds. There's also other minorities who they have brought to their kind of rainbow coalition, if you will, introducing a level of diversity in the Turkish parliament we haven't seen before, which is a good thing. But, I mean, if you have a government committed to not pursuing the peace process, there's going to be a limit, to what the HDP can deliver to voters, and there will be almost inevitably a kind of competition set up between the HDP and the PKK. And you may be seeing some of that play out already in southeastern Turkey and some of these disturbances and assassinations, etc. Secondly, let's play out the other option, which is that the president succeeds in running out the clock, and we go to new elections. His calculus, to some degree, has to be that he's going to get, a majority and hopefully a supermajority to carry out his own ambitions that we've described earlier. Some of that will come perhaps from the MHP vote going down, as Aykan speculated earlier, based on the exit polls. The other has to be on HDP's vote going down as well, and hopefully going down so low that they don't actually make it into the parliament. I mean, you almost have to have that happen if you want to get to 330 votes in the parliament and get to the supermajority that Erdogan wants. You could see him being tempted if the vote goes low enough. That is to say, if the vote ends up being, and you could imagine in a second vote 4 or 5 months from now, you're not going to have the same kind of intensity as you had in the previous election. You might not get as high a turnout. Turnout was quite high, 10% higher than in the presidential election last August. You might have a lower turnout. You might be able to drive that vote down to, say, 10.2%, at which point the temptation to manipulate the election returns to keep them below 10% could become extremely high. If you were to end up with a result in which, after having 80 Kurdish parliamentarians in the parliament for 4 or 5 months, you have an election and suddenly there are 0 Kurdish parliamentarians in the parliament, I think you can spin this out in ways that potentially are devastating on this issue and lead down a road to a lot of instability and potentially violence in Turkey.
I got several more questions particularly about the impact on Turkish foreign policy, Syria question, as well as what the U.S. ought to be doing at this important but uncertain time in Turkish history. But I do want to go over to the audience and begin taking some questions. If you can really keep it to a question, maybe a very brief comment, identify yourself. We'll try and take 3 in a row, and if you just raise your hand, I'll try and catch you. In the front row, Harold Road.
Hi, Harold Road. Let's talk, if you don't mind. I'd like to hear what you all have to say the long term. If you look at Kurdish identity in Turkey and throughout the region, you just take when Barzani sent troops across southern Turkey to fight in Kobani, the remarkable response of the people. Oh my God, our guys, our people, we're them, they're like us, we're the same. If you look at the rallies on Nowruz or Nevruz in Turkish for in what the Kurds are calling Ahmet, which is Diyarbakir, and even on the Turkish, rather on the city hall of Diyarbakir, it says in Turkish, and right below it says in Kurdish the city hall of Ahmet. If you see the flags, they're all Kurdish. The question is, do you see in the long term, if let's say Eric's scenario here of a disaster, because the Kurds, let's say in a new election, would get 0, do you see the Kurds of Turkey moving in a different direction? Because they clearly feel a strong sense of identity with the people just south of them.
Okay, thank you, Harold. And then there was this lady in the 3rd row back here. Wait for the mic, please.
Hi, my question to Dr. Erdemir. I know I'm a British Egyptian. I know a lot of Muslim Brotherhood fan of Erdogan have prayed and finished the Quran before the election, praying for his success. Do you see any change in the relationship between the Muslim Brotherhood and Erdogan in the future, and his relationship with the Sisi regime in Egypt? Thank you.
Okay, why don't we let Eric answer the first question on where this Kurdish question is going? Is it can the Turkish Republic stay on top of this, Eric, and manage it, or are we headed towards a much messier breakup?
I think they can for a few years, but Harold asked us to focus on the longer term, and in the longer term, I think we're dealing with a really volatile situation here, because just look at the president's, that is to say, President Erdogan's response to the advance of Kurdish forces in northeastern Syria toward Tel Abyad. It's clear he would rather see that area remain an ISIL-dominated no man's land than to see the Kurds successful there. It's the same logic that he had for withholding support for Kobani. Perhaps because he was afraid of precisely what you described, Harold, in terms of the reaction to the KRG forces arriving in Kobani. When you think about it in the long term, and you think about the fragmentation we already see in Syria, and my own view is the idea that Syria is going to get, that the Syrian Humpty Dumpty is going to get put back together again is pretty hard to credit after the amount of killing and movement of population that's gone on there. The still potential for the fragmentation of Iraq and certainly the emergence of the KRG as potentially a proto-state, a proto-Kurdish state. And if you then layer on top of that, an inability of the Turkish political system to deal with this issue, I think you've got a very combustible mix.
To answer your question about Egypt, I think we should approach it not as a bilateral issue, but as a transnational issue. Right from the very start, I have always argued that Erdogan's policies and politics cannot be interpreted within the nation-state borders. Erdogan's policies, right from the start, have been transnational. It has always been a Muslim Brotherhood-oriented policy, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Jordan, whether it's in Egypt, and he's even trying to build a network from Malaysia to the Balkans. He is a visionary transnationalist politician, who come quite rarely in Turkish politics. So vis-a-vis Egypt, I would not expect much to change. Unless it's a grand coalition with CHP, because we know that CHP is very interested in mending ties with Armenia, with Israel, with Syria, with Egypt, and we know that Erdogan and Davutoğlu are quite hardliners in that regard. So it all depends, I would argue, on the outcome of elections, but we should never assume, no matter what the results of Turkish elections are, Erdogan and his people will be deeply committed to Muslim Brotherhood majoritarianism in all the Muslim majority countries.
Thank you. There was why don't we go here first in the third row, and then this gentleman in the fourth row.
My name is Ragıp Soylu from the Sabah. I have two questions, brief
No,
questions.
just one question, please.
Okay. What would be the reason for the silence of Israel after the election results? And what do you think about Israeli reaction in general?
Okay, great. Thank you. And there's a question in the fourth row.
Thank you. Tolga Tanis.
I'm sorry, say your name again?
Tolga Tanis with Hürriyet. I have a short question for Eric. Mr. Ambassador, the anecdote that you shared was very interesting to me. And could you please elaborate when you said that we have a problem but no one is listening to me regarding the situation in Turkey when we were ambassador? What was the thing that you, the thing that forced you to think this way? And when it comes today, how do you see the current administration approach to the Turkish government, Ankara administration, or to Erdogan government? And if you see that the administration right now is still on the same page when you were in 10 years ago, what was the breaking point?
Okay, let's take those two. First, does anybody want to take the Israel question? Anybody got a good theory on what's Israel doing, or maybe even more importantly, whether this is going to have any impact on the awful relations between the AKP and Erdogan and Israel?
Well, I haven't talked to anyone in Israel, so all of this is, untainted by any actual knowledge. But my sense is that Israelis have, for a long time, viewed the potential of the relationship between Israel and Turkey as kind of transcending Erdogan, and they continue to hope, almost against hope, that somehow the kind of strategic partnership of the 90s can be resuscitated. And I suspect right now what you're seeing is a lot of caution in Israel in the face of these kind of imponderable almost uncertainties of Turkish politics. Why say anything at this point when almost anything you say can and will be used against you, certainly by the AKP and its leadership. So I expect that they're just watching and waiting and trying to see what comes out of this, and then hope that they can get the relationship back onto a more stable footing. I don't know, Aykan, if you have a different view.
In my dealings with my Israeli and American counterparts, I've always recommended silence as the best way to deal with AKP, because no matter what they say,
right.
American officials or Israel officials, no matter what they say, positive or negative, it will be spun through the government mouthpiece propaganda machine. I've never seen, I'm an expert on hate speech and hate crimes, and I've never seen the extent to which hate and prejudice have been strategically deployed by leading government figures in Turkey. Sure, Turkey has always had some level of prejudice and stereotyping and marginalization, but I think especially since 2009, we are at a stage where there is a constant pumping of hate and prejudice by leading government figures. So the best way to prevent that, I think, would be silence, because no matter what you say, it would be fueling the fires of anti-Semitic hatred or prejudice or conspiracy theories. So I think it's very prudent.
I have to follow up on that because, as you say, since 2009, that's coincident with President Obama's presidency. I don't think that he's been a president who's been particularly forceful in speaking publicly about any concerns he might have regarding Turkey until very recently. And yet we have seen this steady deterioration with Erdogan. He doesn't seem to need necessarily excuses to engage in this kind of behavior. But just quickly on what you would say then, what the president did the day after the elections in making his toughest statement yet about the lack of Turkish action on that border with Syria and shutting it down to foreign fighters and ISIS financing. Your guess is that that's probably unhelpful at this point in time and actually will help Erdogan, or is he particularly vulnerable and now is the time, if there ever was one, for the Americans to kind of press on behalf of our own national interests vis-a-vis this government in Turkey? Icon, you want to try that? Eric?
And I want to get back to Tolga's question too. I don't want to let that get lost in this. I agree, I think, with up to a point with Icon, which is I don't think we should be commenting at all on, the coalition negotiations, the prospects. We deal with one government at a time. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times when I was ambassador to Turkey, Turks would come up to me and say, your government, and they didn't mean the U.S. government, they meant the Turkish government that somehow we had, put into power somehow. But we ought to let that process go on its own and play itself out without any comment or kibitzing from the United States. On the other hand, I think it's not a bad thing at all that the president drew attention to the concerns we have about the border. They're serious. This is a real problem. And I think, particularly at this point in time, it's not a bad thing for the President of the United States to be publicly articulating that, frankly, for whoever emerges in the Turkish government to take into account. So I would be, in favor of that. Just on, Tolga, on your question, the ravages of age make it hard for me to actually remember exactly what I had in my mind when I had that conversation with John more than a decade ago, or almost a decade ago. But luckily, you can read a lot of the reporting that came out of the embassy when I was there, thanks to WikiLeaks. Now, you can do that. I can't, because I still hold clearances, and so it would be a security violation for me to download any of those telegrams, because they're still technically classified. But I think what you would see if you looked through the reporting that we did in that period, that there was a general sense of both the Prime Minister's personal growing authoritarianism in terms of his personality, as well as some phenomena we saw in the party itself that were troublesome and worrisome to several of us. And by the way, I see in the back one of my distinguished successors, whose reporting has also been made public by WikiLeaks, and I think during Ambassador Jeffrey's time, you'll see some similar kinds of concerns expressed about different elements that made it. So it was not unique to me, first of all, and I think you asked why didn't the U.S. government do something about it? I think John really put his finger on it, because there's been a real wish on the part of policymakers in Washington to see the Turkey that they would like to see, as opposed to the one that actually exists. Well, I can't really speak for today, because I know you're shocked by this, but the administration doesn't consult me very much on Turkey policy.
These two, and then the gentleman in front, please pass the mic to him, but try and make it short if you can.
Thank you. My name is Kani Sulam. I'm with the American Kurdish Information Network. 2 days before the election, 2 bombs exploded at an election rally in Diyarbakir, the capital of the Kurds. An ISIS member was arrested. Given Mr. Erdogan's sympathies for ISIS, and given the hot war between YPG and ISIS in Syria, is it going to be possible to stop the mayhem of Syria and Iraq out of Turkey?
Okay, and pass it to the gentleman in front of you, please, if you can.
Hossein Shabazi from Webster University. I'd like to get the comment of Ambassador. We know that, as you said, the foreign policy perhaps will go beyond the transition. But still like to get your comments on Turkish foreign policy towards Syria, and perhaps, with the emergence of the new policy in Saudi Arabia, and how do they work out? Thank you.
Thank you. Icon, do you want to handle that first one?
Sure. Now, in the exit polls, what we saw was 29% of the voters for HDP said that the bombing in Diyarbakir had influenced their vote. So the bombing had a major effect on the outcome of Turkish elections. And in the months to come, I think the security situation in the region will have a major impact on the future of both the peace process in Turkey and also on the nature of Turkish-Kurdish relations in the region. We should, I think, be prepared not only for tensions between Turkey's Kurdish population and the Turkish state, but also for what I call proxy wars within the Kurdish community in Turkey. We see a rise in tension between the Kurdish Hezbollah, Turkey's Hezbollah, which is predominantly Kurdish, and PKK. We see a few assassinations. We see growing tensions, intercommunal tensions. And these, of course, have transnational aspects. They can spill over to neighboring territories, or the clashes in the neighboring territories can very easily spill back over into Turkish territory. Keep in mind, we don't only have weapons and logistical support and money going both ways, but we also have funerals coming back from the fighting in Iraq and Syria. And every time a Kurdish funeral comes back home, it adds to the fields of intracommunal tensions. And I think no matter what kind of a coalition arrangement comes out of the talks, the bargaining, the Kurdish peace process and handling of this delicate situation should be a key priority.
Eric, can I just on Turkish foreign policy, but if you can and focus a bit on Syria, are we likely, or is it possible in light of these elections that we'll see any real improvements in Turkish policy in support of the U.S.-led coalition in Syria and Iraq?
It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I have a very good or helpful answer, John, to be honest. One of the things that's striking about kind of the election and Turkish Syria policy is the fact that the president and prime ministers, former foreign ministers' policy towards Syria has been for quite some time terribly unpopular in Turkey. It's never been a popular policy. And I've even seen some speculation in the Turkish press that the Syria policy is, we've focused on, Erdogan's ambitions and the economy as the causes of the election result, but there's some speculation in Turkish press, I think, inside AKP, that the Syria policy at least is partially responsible for some of what transpired in the election. So, I'm not really sure, and I think you could probably argue it round or flat what the impact of that is going to be on Syria policy now. On the one hand, I believe that Turkey and the governing leadership is going to be primarily focused inwardly for the next few months while they sort out the politics of all this. And that, on the one hand, might argue against any activism, in Syria, et cetera. On the other hand, you're going to have a kind of interim government in place until this sorts out. And you're going to have Erdogan trying to continue to exert incrementally his presidential authority. And so it's not unheard of in these kinds of situations for a external crisis to be tempting as a way of helping resolve the internal political debate. So I think one can imagine it going either way.
Let me just ask, because there's two big institutions or movements that we haven't talked about that traditionally seem to have been quite important in recent years or even longer in Turkish politics. One, of course, is the military, and whether anything is happening in the military that's significant or meaningful, or we ought to keep our eyes on in the coming weeks and months, particularly as the uncertainty of these coalition politics now play themselves out. And the second is the what Erdogan has called the parallel state, in particular the Gulenist movement inside of Turkey. Is his offensive and campaign to crush all remnants of the Gulenist movement within Turkey? Is that likely to continue? Is it supported by other parties, or in light of the elections, is he going to back off of that? Hakan, let's start with you.
I think the Turkish military has been invited back into politics to a limited extent by Erdogan in his fight against the Gülen community. And on the Turkish military side, I think this was a tactical acceptance of coming back into politics as Erdogan's short-term ally in the fight against the Gülen community. Of course, what this might bring in the mid to long term is just anybody's guess. Vis-a-vis the election results, I think now that Erdogan seems to be losing his single-handed grip on power, this could possibly give the military a relative upper hand in their tactical alliance with Erdogan against the Gülen community. Now, the Gülen community and the elections, if I have to comment on that, for the first time there were, if I'm not mistaken, 6 candidates associated with the Gülen community. They did not receive a huge percentage of the vote, and one comment after the elections was the result could actually undermine Erdogan's conspiracy theories, and people could simply say that the so-called parallel state, which is controlling everything in Turkey, was actually just a couple of 100,000 of votes, which is yet another reflection of the inability of Erdogan to deal with such a small kind of interest group in Turkey. So the results of the elections were a mixed result. On the one hand, it showed that Gülen community does not necessarily have mass support in terms of voters, but at the same time, it also kind of undermined Erdogan's conspiracy theory that the Gülenists are everywhere and they have infiltrated the Turkish state.
Eric, have you got?
Well, I would just say that I think the Turkish military, although it remains one of the largest militaries in NATO, I think emerges from the last decade really a shadow of itself, and I think one has to really have some doubts about what the exact capabilities of the Turkish military are. It's hard to imagine that a military that's had over 100 general officers indicted and jailed, some of them now being released, or convictions overturned on appeal, etc. But it's very hard to imagine such a military having a great deal of capability. Think about the Soviet military in the aftermath of the Stalinist purges. You remove that significant a level of leadership in a military organization, and it's very hard not to have considerable effects. We'll know a little bit more at the end of this summer when the Supreme Military Council meets, and we see what military leadership emerges from that, and what kind of view they have. I agree with Aykan that the military has no love for the Gülen movement, because they see the Gülen movement even more than Erdogan, although Erdogan clearly took advantage of it, as the authors of the Ergenekon, Balyoz, Cage, all these series of conspiracy trials which have laid waste to the military. What they do, in a post, kind of parallel state environment, if you will, remains to be seen. And particularly if you start to get a lot of violence, I think the military was quite shocked by the HDP result, and is still trying to absorb that and absorb what that means. for them and for Turkey. So I think it's another one of these very big uncertainties that's out there. And I think we're just going to have to see what it means over time.
Let me just try and get very rapid yes or no kind of responses. A little bit of elaboration would be okay. Eric mentioned these corruption scandals that occurred at the end of 2013 and 2014. Erdogan and the AKP managed to bury those and stop those investigations from going forward. Allegedly, former President Gül was actually in favor of having those ministers, those investigations continue. What are the chances, do you think? Are these investigations likely to be resurrected in the near future? Okay.
One speculation could be that if these investigations are to be part of the coalition bargaining, there could be kind of horse trading. The opposition could ask for maybe 2 of the ministers of AKP's choice, and we have strong suspicions to believe who those could be. Ministers who are also unpopular with the AKP grassroots. For example, Egemen Baş, whose comments on the Quran were most unwelcome at AKP's conservative base, could be the ministers going for the investigation. But another theory in Ankara is that the investigations will not be part of the coalition agreements, since party groups, according to the Turkish constitution, are not allowed to take binding decisions on the vote, on these investigation votes. So the parties could simply say that it's up to the individual deputies to decide, and in the new parliamentary arithmetic, if a majority of the deputies decide to send the 4 ministers to the Constitutional Court to be tried, then what can we do? So this could then end up sending 4 ministers to the Constitutional Court, and this would be outside of the coalition agreements.
Well, I think the president's going to do anything and everything he can to keep any of this from happening. I just don't think he wants people replaying all the tapes of him telling Bilal to go hide the money and go talk to his sister Sumaya about what to do with it, that she'll know the answer. I don't see that happening.
Okay, one final quick yes or no question. Does Erdogan survive to the end of his first term as president?
I would say yes, but now he has a chance of not winning the second round.
Eric?
I agree with that.
Great. Well, we've come to the end of the session. Please join me in thanking our 2 terrific panelists.